Hello, this is Adult Sunday School for January 10th. I'm Wayne Miller. Tricia and I have been reading together in the book of Isaiah, and as we have read, I have been struck by how much of the first few chapters, and quite a bit later on, applies very directly to our present time and situation. So this week, we're going to look at the first few verses of the book of the prophet Isaiah. First, let's consider the nature of the work, and that is related in the very first verse. Let me read it. The vision concerning Judah and Jerusalem that Isaiah, son of Amos, saw during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. Now this verse tells us quite a lot. First, the author is named Isaiah. We don't know much about him other than what we can glean from this book itself, and he includes a lot less autobiographical information than, say, Jeremiah. But there is no doubt that he was a real person, and that he lived during the time of the named kings. Modern scholars generally agree that he wrote at least the first 39 chapters of the book. The rest, most believe, was written after the lifetime of this person Isaiah by persons unknown. In fact, many believe that it was written effectively by committee. Now, I personally think the evidence is clear that he wrote the whole book, but that entails believing that he was somehow enabled to experience things that would occur long after his lifetime, during and after the exile. Now, this is a bit of a stretch, but we have the example of John the Apostle, who certainly wrote the Revelation in this way. Further, a number of words and expressions occur in both parts of the book, or all three if you want to go with the scholars who are convinced that there were three Isaiahs. But they occur only rarely or not at all in other scripture. The structure of the book also is one of unity, and it's consistent with a single author. However, what's really important is that we agree that the whole book is direct revelation from God. It is God-breathed. It is inspired. However it may have been written. Second, we have the subject, a vision about Judah and Judah and Jerusalem. I had Jeremiah on my mind because I just mentioned him. Now, this does not mean a continuous vision as we think about it, sort of a dreamlike state running on for years. Rather, the term is used to denote the divine source of the message. We really don't know or need to know precisely how God gave Isaiah the message. Some may have been in what we would call a vision, or a series of visions. Some may have been an audible voice, but neither is necessary. Somehow Isaiah knew what God wanted him to speak and then to write down. The third thing we find in this verse is a time frame. The vision came during the reign of 4 kings of Judah, and their reigns spanned from 792 to 686 BC. Uzziah was the first of them. He was also known as Azariah, and he was one of the kings who, we are told, did right in the sight of the Lord. However, after some time he grew proud, and in his pride he assumed a priestly role and offered incense in the temple, which only the authorized priests were to do. God punished him by striking him with leprosy. While he remained king in name, he was isolated, and his son Jotham actually functioned as king for the last 10 years of his life. Jotham also did right in the eyes of the Lord. His reign, as far as we know, was relatively uneventful. Toward the end of his reign, the Syro-Ephraimite coalition was formed, which later threatened Judah. This was a coalition between the northern kingdom of Israel, referred to as Ephraim, and the Syrian Empire headquartered in Damascus. Ahaz was a weak king who did not do right in the eyes of the Lord. He sacrificed his son to a pagan god, among other evil deeds. During his reign, the Syro-Ephraimite coalition attacked Judah, and he allied himself with Assyria to fend them off. And we have to be careful not to get Syria and Assyria confused, because they were on opposite sides here. Ahaz also imported worship of false gods from Syria when Assyria had defeated Damascus, and he went to Damascus to meet the king of Assyria. But following Ahaz, Hezekiah, his son, was one of the best kings of Judah. He destroyed the altars to false gods which had been around for more than 100 years, which had existed even through the reigns of several of the good kings. And he trusted in Yahweh, the God of Israel. He defeated the invading Assyrians through prayer and faith without even fighting a battle. And that's a delightful story. If you aren't familiar with it, look it up. You will find it in 2 Kings. I think it's about chapter 16 or so, 16, 17, somewhere in there. You can find it. Anyway, with that background, let's move into the message of the first chapter. In verses 2 through 4, we read, "Hear, O heavens! Listen, O earth, for the Lord hath spoken. I reared children and brought them up, but they have rebelled against me. The ox knows his master, the donkey his owner's manger. But Israel does not know. My people do not understand. Ah, sinful nation, a people loaded with guilt, a brood of evildoers, children given to corruption. They have forsaken the Lord. They have spurned the Holy One of Israel and turned their backs on him." Now, as is common in the prophets, this passage is framed as a lawsuit. And also, as is common, it's written in poetic form. The verses we have just read summarize the indictment of the lawsuit, the charges that are brought against Judah. To start with, God calls the heavens and the earth to be cosmic witnesses to these charges. First, in verse 2, Yahweh makes it clear that he is not at fault. The terms reared and brought up signify nurture that brought a weak, helpless child to strong maturity and viability. But Israel rebelled. This word refers to active resistance. Israel has refused the relationship with God that is essential to its well-being. In verse 3, we see a contrast between the dumb animals, the ox and the donkey, and the nation of Judah. Even the ox knows his master, knows that he is dependent on him, and can trust him. And the donkey, he knows where to go to be fed and sustained. But Israel does not know. Does not know what? Well, that they are utterly reliant on God for the sustenance and welfare. That they need God to give them food to survive. We, like them, tend to rely on ourselves. In fact, self-reliance is one of the chief characteristics of our culture. And let's talk about the food. The Israelites should have been familiar with Deuteronomy 8:3. He humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your fathers had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. So they were to trust God and in Him find the source of both physical and spiritual nourishment. And just like them, we forget these basic facts. Instead of relying on God, we rely on our own skill and cunning. Now, in verse 4, God speaks very plainly and directly. He leaves the metaphorical language of verse 3 behind. The word translated in my version, which is the NIV, is actually a stronger word, probably better translated woe. Woe, sinful nation, a people loaded with guilt, a brood of evildoers, children given to corruption. They have forsaken the Lord. They have spurned the Holy One of Israel and turned their backs on him. This is the crux of the indictment. The people of Judah have committed many evil acts. It's their habitual way of life. God has no place in their lives. Oh, they go through all the motions of their religion. They observe the Sabbath and the feasts. They bring their sacrifices. We see that later in chapter 1. But it does not affect the way they treat each other, the way they make decisions, the way they live each day. That, I think, we also can relate to. And incidentally, it's easy to point the finger at somebody else and say, aha, that's how they are living. It's a lot more important for us to point the finger at ourselves and ask the question, is this descriptive of us? Well, the lawsuit goes on, and we can say a lot more about it, but we'll stop there for now. But on Monday evening at 7 o'clock, we will meet via Zoom to discuss both what I have talked about here and, assuming that we get through all of that, we can move on to the following verses. I hope to see you then. You will find the link on the Adult Sunday School page on the church website. Until then, goodbye.